She was America's favorite TV mother, but behind the Partridge family's smiles, Shirley Jones was trapped in a 19-year psychological prison, and the truth about what Jack Cassidy did in the dark will change how you see her forever. For decades, millions of viewers tuned in every week to see the velvet-voiced matriarch driving that multicolored bus, solving light-hearted problems with a song and a smile. She was the epitome of wholesome, the quintessential girl next door who had sung her way through Oklahoma and The Music Man. But while the cameras were rolling on that Technicolor fantasy, Shirley Jones was going home to a reality that was closer to a psychological horror film than a sitcom. She was living in the shadow of a man who was brilliant, charismatic, and deeply, dangerously disturbed. This wasn't just a bad Hollywood marriage. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a complex web of control woven by a man she called a sexual Svengali, and a tragedy fueled by undiagnosed mental illness that would eventually burn everything to the ground. To understand how Shirley Jones, a woman with a reputation for pristine virtue, ended up in this 19-year trap, we have to look at the landscape of 1950s Hollywood and the sheer magnetic force of Jack Cassidy. When they met, Shirley was the golden girl of musical theater. She was young, she was undeniably talented, and she was arguably naive. She was 21 years old, fresh-faced and carrying the weight of being America's sweetheart. Then walked in Jack Cassidy. He was 28, a Broadway aristocrat with a voice like melted butter and a presence that sucked the air out of the room. He was everything Shirley wasn't: experienced, sophisticated, and dangerous. He was the bad boy in the tailored suit. Jack saw in Shirley not just a beautiful woman, but a canvas. He saw raw potential that he could mold, shape, and eventually control. The dynamic was established almost immediately. Jack positioned himself not just as a lover, but as a mentor, a guide to the world of sophistication that Shirley felt excluded from. He was the teacher, she was the student. This power imbalance is the bedrock of almost every coercive relationship, and in their case, it was solidified by the glamour of show business. He dazzled her. He made her feel that without him, she was just a simple girl from a small town. But with him, she was royalty. What she didn't realize then, and what took her nearly 2 decades to fully articulate, was that this mentorship came with a heavy price. He was grooming her, stripping away her autonomy piece by piece, under the guise of expanding her horizons. He was setting the stage for a 19-year performance where he directed every scene, and she was expected to follow a script she hadn't agreed to write. As the marriage progressed, the sexual Svengali aspect of Jack Cassidy truly began to manifest, transforming their private life into a confusing and often harrowing ordeal for Shirley. In her memoir, she bravely peeled back the curtain on this, revealing that Jack was obsessed with sexual exploration that went far beyond the norms of the 1950s and 60s conservative America. He didn't just suggest new things, he orchestrated scenarios that fundamentally challenged Shirley's sense of self. He introduced her to the concept of group sex and open marriage, not as a mutual decision between equals, but as a test of her love and sophistication. He made her feel that her reluctance was a sign of her immaturity, a remnant of her girl-next-door persona that she needed to shed to be truly worthy of him. He thrived on the control he had over her sexuality. By pushing her into these situations, he was effectively isolating her from her own moral compass. It is a classic psychological maneuver. If you can get someone to transgress their own boundaries for you, you own them. You become the only person who knows their dirty little secrets, creating a bond of shame and complicity that is incredibly difficult to break. Jack wanted to be the architect of her entire existence. He picked her clothes, he critiqued her performances, and he curated her bedroom activities. There was a terrifying duality to it. In public, they were the glittering Hollywood power couple, posing for magazine covers and smiling at premieres. In private, Jack was pushing Shirley into encounters involving other men and women, watching her discomfort, perhaps even feeding off it. He convinced her that this was what modern, sophisticated love looked like, gaslighting her into suppressing her own instincts. But the control wasn't just physical or sexual, it was deeply rooted in professional jealousy, which brings us to the second, perhaps even more destructive layer of this trap, Jack's malignant narcissism and his battle with what we now understand as bipolar disorder. Jack Cassidy was a phenomenally talented performer. He was a Broadway legend, holding Tony Awards and the adoration of theater critics. However, Hollywood fame, the kind that reaches every living room in America, eluded him. Shirley, on the other hand, had it in spades. She was a movie star. The tension reached a boiling point in 1960 when Shirley won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role in Elmer Gantry. This should have been the happiest night of their lives. A husband should have been beaming with pride. Instead, the ride to the ceremony and the aftermath were steeped in a thick, suffocating tension. Jack could not handle her success. To a narcissist, a partner's success isn't a shared victory. It is a direct threat. It is a spotlight that is shining on someone else, leaving them in the dark. Shirley later recounted how his mood shifted, how his congratulations were laced with bitterness. He made her feel guilty for winning. He made her feel that her success was an act of betrayal against his own struggling career. This is the insidious nature of the psychological prison. The prisoner learns to fear their own achievements because they know it will trigger the warden's wrath. Jack's mental health deteriorated as the years went on. He would cycle through manic episodes where he was the life of the party, spending money they didn't have, renovating houses on a whim, and charming everyone he met. These highs were seductive. They reminded Shirley of the man she fell in love with, but they were always followed by the crash, deep, dark depressions and explosive rages. He would disappear for days. He would lash out with cruel verbal abuse, targeting Shirley's insecurities, tearing down her confidence to ensure she remained dependent on him. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but in that era, treatment was often stigmatized or ineffective, and Jack often refused to admit there was a problem. He preferred to view the world as the problem, with Shirley as the convenient scapegoat for his frustrations. Then came the ultimate irony, the twist that feels too scripted to be real, but is absolute historical fact. In 1970, Shirley was cast as Shirley Partridge in the Partridge Family. The show was a monster hit. It was a show about a musical family led by a single mother. The producers, seeing the chemistry and the potential for a marketing goldmine, actually offered the role of the father to Jack in the pilot stages. It would have been the perfect synergy, real-life husband and wife playing TV husband and wife. But Jack refused. His ego could not withstand the idea of playing Mr. Shirley Jones. He didn't want to be the sidekick in her show. So, the role of the father was written out, and Shirley became the iconic single mother. But here is where the knife twists deeper. The breakout star of the show, the teen idol who would come to define the generation, was David Cassidy, Jack's son from his first marriage. Shirley was now the stepmother to Jack's son, achieving massive global fame with him, while Jack sat on the sidelines. The jealousy he felt toward Shirley was now compounded by the jealousy he felt toward his own flesh and blood. David was becoming the superstar Jack always believed he deserved to be. The Partridge family house was filled with music and laughter on screen, but the Cassidy home was a war zone. While Shirley was filming scenes about teenage crushes and family band rehearsals, she was going home to a husband who was unraveling. Jack became increasingly erratic. His drinking escalated. His behavior became more unpredictable. He would show up on set, creating uncomfortable scenes, his presence looming over the production like a storm cloud. Shirley was living a double life of exhausting proportions. By day, she had to maintain the bubbly, unflappable persona of Shirley Partridge, a character who had it all together. By night, she was managing a volatile man who was capable of extreme psychological cruelty. She was the breadwinner, the stabilizer, and the punching bag for his ego. The juxtaposition is jarring. Imagine the mental fortitude required to sing "Come On, Get Happy" while you are terrified of what awaits you when you unlock your front door. Eventually, the center could not hold. The breaking point didn't come from a single argument, but from the realization that staying would destroy not just her, but her children. Shirley Jones, the woman who had been molded and controlled for nearly 2 decades, finally found the strength to initiate a separation. It was a decision fraught with terror, because leaving a controller is often the most dangerous time in a relationship. Jack did not take it well. His spiral accelerated. Without Shirley as his anchor and his audience, he drifted further into mania and paranoia. The end of Jack Cassidy is a tragedy that reads like a Gothic novel, a fiery punctuation mark to a turbulent life. In 1976, after they had divorced, but while the wounds were still fresh, Jack was living alone in a penthouse apartment in West Hollywood. He had spent the day drinking, spiraling into one of his dark moods. He returned to the apartment, lit a cigarette, and fell asleep on the Naugahyde couch. The cigarette dropped. The fire that ensued was an inferno. It swept through the apartment with terrifying speed. Shirley received the call that every former spouse dreads. But the horror wasn't just in the news of his death, it was in the details. The body was burned beyond recognition. The authorities needed someone to identify him, not by his face, because his face was gone, but by his jewelry. Shirley had to identify the man who had controlled her life for 19 years by the family signet ring, melted onto his hand, and a Star of David pendant she had given him. It was a gruesome, devastating end to a man who had been so consumed by his own fire in life. Even in death, Jack Cassidy cast a long shadow. Shirley was left to pick up the pieces, to grieve a man who had tormented her, and to explain to the world how she could love a monster. And that is the complex truth she leaves us with. She did love him. She loved the brilliance, the talent, and the man he could have been. In her later years, Shirley was open about the fact that despite the abuse, despite the infidelity, despite the sexual Svengali games, Jack was the love of her life. This admission is perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the trap. It illustrates how deep the psychological hooks were set. It wasn't just fear that kept her there. It was a profound, manipulated attachment to the very person who was hurting her. Shirley Jones survived. She rebuilt her life. She continued to work. And she protected her children. But when you watch those reruns of the Partridge Family now, you have to look closer. Behind the bright eyes of Mrs. Partridge, there is a steeliness, a resilience forged in the fires of a 19-year ordeal. She wasn't just acting the part of a strong mother, she was practicing for her survival. Jack Cassidy may have tried to own her, to rewrite her identity, and to trap her in his shadow, but in the end, she is the one who walked out of the fire, telling her story on her own terms. The broken pedestal of their marriage reveals that the strongest women on television often have to be even stronger in real life. It forces us to ask, how many other smiling faces are hiding a history of survival?